Welcome, everybody. I'm Donnie Berkholz, and I'm here to moderate our panel today on what do SLOs really mean. This is going to be starting not quite with the very basics, but just a little bit past that and helping you get to the next steps. Lots of people might get started with something like latency targets or error rate targets, but there's a lot more that SLOs can deliver. So today I'm here with an esteemed panel to walk through that in more detail. I'd love to ask them to each introduce themselves, starting with Adriana.
Hey, I'm Adriana Villela. I'm a senior developer advocate at Lightstep.
And Adriana, what is one of the biggest challenges you have with SLOs?
Well, so prior to coming to Lightstep, I actually ran a platform team and an observability team at Tucows. And the platform team, one of the challenges there was like getting them to start like wrapping their minds around using SLOs. I think that was the biggest challenge.
Thank you. Next, we've got Alex.
Hi, my name is Alexandra McCoy, and I'm an SRE engineer at VMware.
What's one of the biggest challenges you have with SLOs?
Well, our SLO process at VMware involves getting our SaaS engineering teams together. During that process, I would say just scheduling that time to invest the time to start having that discussion about the product and the direction and creation of the SLOs was really difficult. I think oftentimes anyone who's in a technical role, sometimes we're focused on the technical aspects of things and we don't really pay attention to or give credit to taking that time and blocking off that time from the technical work to have those conversations. But once you get all of the right technical individuals in the room, what we found is that discussion starts to happen a little bit more authentically.
Thank you. And Max.
Hey, everybody. I'm Max Nee. I'm a staff software engineer at the New York Times. And I'm responsible for, making sure helping teams deliver software.
And what's one of your biggest challenges with SLOs?
Communicating them effectively to other teams at the New York Times. We run a platform, and to help discern like what is a true error state of our application, to make sure that like everybody's on the same page and like when to raise an alert if something's wrong.
Thank you. And we'll bring it back to Adriana. In your experience at Lightstep and at Tucows, how do you approach defining SLOs in a way that really helps your team understand the system's performance rather than just kind of focusing on specific metrics that come out of a book like latency or error rate?
I think one of the major learnings around that is making sure that the SLOs target the right thing. I know that's like a really broad thing to say, but specifically, I think it's really tempting to define an SLO at the API level, but you don't want to do that. You want to get it more to the client side of things. So I think avoiding that temptation is key.
Thank you. Either of our other panelists want to add something to that?
I guess I would say I agree. I always say starting out, or in our organization, we always say starting out with your building out your SLIs and your SLOs, you really want to be customer centric. And sometimes it's really easy to go in and just start having an alert-based mindset, looking at CPU, looking at memory, but you really want to break that system down into subcomponents and then understand how those components are working together to provide some functionality or capability to the customer, and start from there. It's easier said than done. When we start having that conversation and working together, we really have to actively think about those things.
Interesting. And Alex, have you had a time where you've had to adjust those SLOs over time, where you had to redefine them? Maybe they started too infrastructure focused and you wanted to shift them into that customer experience approach?
We're still in our early stages, but we do document our SLOs within a dashboard. We have like a technical setup My team is globally dispersed, so there's a lot of, dispersed collaboration. So we do a lot of dashboarding with it and have technical things in place. When we iterate on that, there's a lot of documentation that goes into our SLIs and SLOs. So what we do is we just make sure we keep those communication channels open with our engineering teams and iterate on it. So even when we start out, I know it's not good practice to just come up with, some standard or current performance rate, but sometimes we may not know what that accurate target is. And we might, just generalize and come up with a number and then watch performance over time and then make adjustments accordingly. But it is definitely a collaborative effort between our team that's handling SRE enablement and our SaaS engineering teams that understand the underlying, working of with the system.
Right. Thank you. And now I'm going to jump over to Max. At the New York Times, obviously known for high quality journalism and a great digital experience. How do SLOs help ensure that the platform really consistently meets those high standards, and what challenges have you run into along the way?
Sure. So that's a really good question. SLOs really come in handy during elections. There is a lot of effort to be prepared for elections where there's a war room usually set up, and all the dependent systems, even if you're tangentially related, like our team, we're not necessarily responsible for the journalism platforms, but we're still on call and increase our capacity in case there's a bug fix that needs to get out immediately. Those SLOs can help us sort of watch the dashboards as opposed to like keeping an eye on social media, saying like, hey, the needle's not working properly, or hey, is it down, right? Like you never want to get those messages from like outside of your organization. You want to see them from inside your dashboards.
Thank you. Now, Adriana, Lightstep is really known around a lot of the work it does in the observability space. How do you see SLOs fitting into a broader observability strategy for a company?
I would say that in terms of them fitting into broader observability strategy, SLOs are the thing that should eventually replace those pesky old dashboards that so many folks have been accustomed to using in the past, especially when dealing with incidents. The idea being that we create alerts based on SLOs. We make SLOs living, breathing things that we created, which I think Alex has mentioned that as well. And we make our SLOs actionable by tying them to our observability data so that, it's it's something meaningful.
Now, what do you think about those dashboards? Like, are they gone then, or are they sort of just something that sits in the background and you end up jumping into them later if you notice a problem through an SLO?
Yeah, I think they end up being minimized. It's less reliance on the dashboards, especially because dashboards represent more of like, a fixed problem that we've experienced before rather than stuff that hasn't been seen, like novel problems, right? It's almost like, oh, let's create a dashboard for this because that's happened before, and let's create a dashboard for that because that's happened before. And next thing you've got this explosion of dashboards, and now you're like having to look at a bunch of things at the same time. And I feel like minimizing on the dashboards, honing in on the SLO-based alerts, it really helps to focus the problem to where the problem actually is. And then there's also like that fine line of making sure that, yes, you create these SLO-based alerts, but let's not make them so sensitive that you jump at every little thing, right? And you're waking up your on-call engineer for no reason. So then it'll involve a little bit of tweaking. I'm sure it's going to be one of those things where in the beginning, it's going to be like way too sensitive. And then as you get more and more used to it, it becomes less and less sensitive so that you've found your sweet spot.
Right. And Alex, did you want to add something to that?
Adriana mentioned something about making the alerts actionable and incident management. And it really stuck out to me because when we started our process, we went through a workshop portion. So how do we build this workshop where whenever we're going through building out SLIs and SLOs with our team, it's repeatable and we can do it with another SaaS engineering team. But the one thing that we did do was we used our incident management, or I guess organization. I don't know if we really have an incident management organization, but we used our incident management teams and processes in order to validate what we were seeing in our SLO dashboards and alerts. And I think that if you look at, I think it's Dickerson's hierarchy of service reliability, incident management is in one of the mid tiers, but I don't think people give that area as much credit and utilize that data and those teams in order to validate, what your SLO dashboards are reporting versus what incidents are you seeing your customers come in, like what areas are they having the most trouble with, and then assessing that data and really using it. And how do we build out these error budget dashboards that, if we're seeing burn, then we're actively doing something and even mitigating incidents from happening in a customer experience and, some disruption.
Mm-hmm. Now, Adriana, one point I'd love to go back to is, as you think about less of those customized dashboards, less of those customized alerts, that starts to ask a lot more of the teams who have to investigate the problems to understand how to exactly drill in what things might be correlated. What kinds of tools, techniques, tips do you have that you've been able to leverage those?
Well, I think one of the things that is definitely going to help folks a lot is the use of open telemetry. Because I'm actually I work closely in the open telemetry space, and recently I believe metrics and traces are already in general availability, I believe, and then logs are on their way. And the nice thing is the way that things are being done, everything is correlated. So you say you have a metric, you can correlate that now to a trace, and you can correlate the trace to a log. So now you have a means for following those breadcrumbs to get to the heart of the problem. And, different observability tools have different approaches to that. But with open telemetry, because so many observability vendors, I'd say most of them have gone all in on open telemetry, and that's the standard that everyone is instrumenting on. They have that support. Then it becomes a matter of how is it that that particular vendor approaches displaying the data so that you can follow the breadcrumbs, but the data is already there, so you have that correlation.
All right. And Max, could you share a little bit about how your applications are instrumented and how you track these down? Do you use open telemetry? Do you use something else, or are they not at all, perhaps?
Yeah, so we actually have an observability practice at the New York Times where we have a standard set of tooling that we require applications to use. We're currently exploring tracing and deciding on which way to go and how we're going to do that. But we do have a centralized dashboarding system that teams on board and use. And with some nudging, we're seeing a lot more adoption of SLOs. So our SLO dashboards then have more granular links to the metrics that drive the SLOs.
And you mentioned something that I've seen in my own experience at other large companies too, which is a lot of times an SRE team or a platform team might be left running the application and doesn't have as much ability to get that instrumentation back into the code base, into the key transactions that really matter. I see a lot of nodding going on here. Alex, I haven't thrown anything your way for a couple of minutes. Is that something that you've run into, and how have you encountered that, or maybe even surmounted that?
Yes, but like everyone else, we do have observability tooling, which in my opinion and from what I understand about building out SLOs and understanding your systems and components. So open telemetry as well as distributed tracing is it's built into our tooling, and it is something that we keep at the foundation of our observability practices.
And maybe one more question for you. What do you see as some of the common misperceptions about SLOs amongst the teams you're working with, either internally or externally in the industry at large?
I think when we think about SLOs, it's easy to regurgitate the definitions, but the actual math and algorithms and really put an emphasis on the SLIs and where you're implementing it. Are we implementing our SLIs in the right place to make sure that we're building out accurate SLOs? I think that's really underrated. And I will say there was a book that kind of helped me to understand this a little bit more. I'm still young in the reliability space, but definitely a fan of it. And based on my experience in the different companies I worked in, I think that it is the right direction that we're going in. And it is something that's needed, especially when we're talking about SaaS and you're having these service level agreements. I consider your SLIs and SLOs to be like your SLA's accountability partners. And, and I think that the difficult part is really grasping the math and algorithms behind the scenes and picking the right metrics, as well as, again, how do we get the right people in the room to have the right conversations? And then when we do build these out, how do we build actionable alerting and making sure that, as Adriana mentioned earlier, that we're not maintaining that same mindset of alerting on what the engineer is expecting, but are we alerting on the actual customer experience? And then are we reducing engineer burnout by ensuring that we're not setting these sensitive alerts based on our SLOs?
Interesting. And do you have, well, I guess two follow-up questions to this one. One is, you mentioned a book. I think everybody's dying to know, what is the book?
Alex Hidalgo's Service Level Objectives. So I actually have all three. I was introduced to reliability engineering when I joined VMware. So I did work alongside reliability teams at a previous organization, but to say that I actually committed and invested in the area was when I joined VMware. And fortunately, I worked with someone that he knew that knew Alex and suggested the textbook. So it is something that I still refer back to whenever I get stumped and need to circle back and refresh.
Nice. And then another side of that question, you talked through the importance of defining the right SLIs. Are there any examples you could walk through of how that whole process worked for you? Who was involved? What was the dialogue like? And how did you get to the end state?
Okay, so we have right now 2 larger engineering teams that are important to our multi-cloud strategy that we focused on first. So I think earlier I mentioned that we actually set up workshops. So the workshops are, how do we get together? And then we start the conversation. And sometimes if engineers cannot commit to the amount of time that we need, we might give them something called pre-work. And then how do we have a conversation and use whatever collaborative tools that are needed to sit and talk about, well, who is the user? What are the personas? And let's in a collaborative way, break this down. And that could take an hour or however long once individuals get to talking. Then when we have these personas or the users, how do we talk about what that journey is? And then how do we take a look at our system and the other things that we have in place and really break down what solutions do we have in place to kind of assess or technically say that support the journey? And then how do we have a conversation around the solutions that we have in place to measure that journey and take it and set expectations of the customer. So we talk about customer happiness when we talk about SLIs and SLOs. So how do we then set expectations around, well, this is based on data or based on what we've seen. If you don't have the data, then what is that threshold for customer, happiness? Or, if we reach this threshold, then we know our customers are going to be upset. So it's like a 4-stage process. And then, and that will be like the first half of the workshop. And then how do we redirect and go into understanding the subcomponents of the system and understanding those system boundaries, and then mapping it back to that journey to make sure that we're looking at the right things. And then what do we have in place to make sure that we are measuring the right things, or we're implementing our SLIs correctly, so that when we build out those SLO thresholds, we're accurately gauging that customer experience.
So at the end of that, how many SLIs did you have?
6 to 8. 6 one time, 8 another. But what we start out with is about 3 to 4. So you want to have, I guess we could call it a backlog. So you want to have a nice backlog of, well, these are the most important things within our system that we're measuring. So we call them high-level SLIs. So these are the 3 to 6 to 8, whatever you want to put in your backlog. These are the things that give us an overall picture of how our system is performing, or the most important pieces of functionality that are going to tell us, that our customers are, upset or, not able to use the system, or whatever the case may be. And then from that, of the, I guess, 3 to 4 most critical, then that's what you would start with. And then you can, there's a prioritization process that goes into this at the end once you build out those SLIs. So you want to base it on feasibility and business impact. And then based on that prioritization, then you would pick, that 6 to 8 and put that in your backlog, and then start out with your 3 to 4 that are highest priority.
And what of those 3 to 4, could you share any examples? Like, what kinds of SLIs did you come up with?
So pretty much looking at, like, let's say the API in the system, or an agent in the system. So what it tells us is, well, is the customer, our multi-cloud interface, is the customer able to assess it based on, a gateway, an underlying gateway agent that we probe?
Got it. Thanks. And now, Max, I'm going to throw you one that you may or may not be prepared to answer. So there's been a lot going on in recent months around things like ChatGPT and generative AI. But of course, machine learning and AI are not new. They've been around for decades and decades. Maybe the New York Times has things in place like recommender systems to suggest next articles they might want to read and so forth. How do you see SLOs adapting to accommodate some of these new technologies? And what kinds of challenges do you think might come up as a result of that?
So I think probably one of the biggest things would be accuracy, right? Like, how do you measure the generative text or these algorithms or their output? Like, how accurate is it? Especially, like, if we're going to recommend news stories to a user, do we want to put SLIs and SLOs in place to make sure that, like, we're recommending the right things? And a potential way to measure that is to see, like, based on n number of recommended articles, how many times are they clicked on, to see if the user actually goes and follows those stories. Like, if we see 0 clicks, then the recommendations are not relevant or useful, which means that the data that is either contained in our recommendation engine is not accurate enough to do that properly. And I think, like, that's a bigger rabbit hole, probably not part of this discussion, but measuring the usefulness and the accuracy of the output of machine learning and AI is probably, like, the biggest thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good point. I'm as a side note, I'm taking a course right now on prompt engineering for developers, and a big part of it is how do you even have the AI test its own output and see if it's the input validates or not. So yes, lots going on in that space for sure. Now, Adriana, you mentioned incident management earlier. In that kind of context, how do you see SLOs helping organizations improve response times and improve resilience? What kinds of practices maybe should they think about putting in place to support that?
Well, I'd say the SLOs help you zero in on the things that you should care about, especially because, I'd say one of the good SLO practices is don't go crazy and create all the SLOs for all the things, right? Like narrow in on the ones that are super important to your organization. So I think it helps you become more thoughtful insofar as like, what are your organization's reliability goals? And then in defining the right SLOs, which, may take some time, right? You might get them right off the bat, but maybe it'll take a few incidents to iterate over before you nail them, but at least it'll help you zero in on where to start looking, where to focus on, etc. And I'd say the other thing that I want to mention is making sure that when you are defining those SLOs, don't get hung up on like how it failed. That's the, like we have data to figure that out. The SLO, you should just know that, you weren't able to make the request, but the reason behind that's not the SLO's business. The SLO will help to, surface some stuff, but the nitty gritty of the why, that's up to your telemetry to help to expose.
Now, when we think about, SLOs, we've all been talking about how they should be measuring things like customer experience. But if you have something behind the scenes at the infrastructure layer that you know to be a fairly frequent cause of some of those things, what level of monitoring should be in place on that? Should there still be alerts, or should we just be watching SLOs?
I'm thinking that you should still be able to launch SLOs around those things, that they should be able to wrap those like key metrics. Yeah, they should be like a wrapper, essentially.
It's like like an example that I'm sure many people have seen if they've been doing this for a little while is logs fill up the file system. So you don't necessarily see the customer impact until after that's happened, and you're already out of space and already getting error messages. You might be able to predict it earlier if you had that volume usage alerting at 90% or 80% or whatever sort of threshold people have. Is that something, maybe Max, do you have a take on that?
Yeah, like if you have a known issue within your system, it's pretty easy to sort of correlate it back to customer impacting SLOs. But you may just want to segment that out as a separate SLI and have an SLO around it, around your potentially infrastructure. Maybe a composite SLO of a few things that are critical to your infrastructure. Disk space on your fleet or your system is an SLI, maybe CPU usage or memory usage. And if you see that composite infrastructure SLO dip below your threshold, then you know that you have a problem that could be a precursor to potentially impacting customers.
And Max, while I've got your attention, how do SLOs change the way that you have conversations with non-technical stakeholders?
I think it's a good sort of level setting and reset of the conversation because it's easier to communicate why customers are having issues, and it's easier to communicate potential fixes because you're now speaking sort of the same language. where engineering is not necessarily speaking in engineering terms of like, oh, we have to fix, you know, where there's an off by one error or something, you know, sort of jargony-ish, you know, where we can sort of hone in on like, there is a problem. Business stakeholders can easily recognize that because your SLO should be in somewhat of a binary plain English or easy to understand idea or concept. And then, you know, when going back to the engineering teams, they can look at the underlying dashboards to further identify and fix the problem.
All right, thank you. We're coming up toward the end of our time. So I'm going to go around and ask each of you if you have one pro tip or lesson to share. Maybe it's a lesson that you've learned the hard way. What would you pass on to people so they don't get to learn the same mistake or the same tough challenge or the same lesson the same way that you did? Adriana, do you have one in mind?
Yeah, one that I was thinking of is when you're setting like your time period for your SLO, this one came up in discussion recently, you know, do you set it to like 28 days or 30 days? And because you're like, well, 30 days is a month, why would it be 28 days? And the reason why you want to do 28 days is because you have because 28 days is the span of 4 weeks, then you're always starting on the same day and always ending on the same day for your SLO. Whereas if you're doing a 30-day SLO, you're starting on the same day of the week and you're ending on a different day of the week. So then it's a lot harder to you know, to reset your period basically.
Mm-hmm. Right, and there's a lot more noise in there too because the number of weekend days versus weekdays differs.
Exactly.
Yeah. Alex, how about you?
I'm not sure. I would say don't be afraid to go back and take a stats course because you might need it. But no, definitely communication is going to be key. Lean on your internal engineers who are working on the system, who understand the system and understand that you don't have to know everything. It's a team sport. And it's an end-to-end process. So when we talk about we don't want to think about it in terms of SLIs or SLOs or alerting or these things. Like it's an end-to-end process, and it's going to take time, and it's going to take communication and involving all of the right individuals, and create some iteration and feedback loops.
Thank you. And last but not least, Max.
I would say don't be afraid to make mistakes when setting your SLIs and SLOs. You know, it is an iterative process. It's just like writing code. You're going to refactor constantly. And, you know, you may feel that the first time you set an SLO, you're nervous and you feel like you're going to get paged a lot. Like that's okay because that could be false positives. Or false negatives, depending on which way your SLO is going. But you know, it is an iterative process, and you'll learn over time, and then you'll have to just restart the process sort of all over again.
All right, well, thank you everybody for your time today. I really enjoyed this discussion, and I hope everybody watching this does as well. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.